Joe Harris here in the workshop. Today we're going to talk about the custom terms and different things that a lot of people have talked about that you may have heard. You may have heard someone say things like greeblies or dusting or various other things like that, or like dry brushing and just anything of that nature that a lot of us use pretty regularly. But if you're new to this, then you may not know what some of it is, so I'm going to explain some of it. One of the terms that's used a lot is kit bashing. You've probably seen this whenever people are talking about model kits or maybe putting different things together with action figures. Well, what it is, it's whenever you're actually bashing together multiple different model kits and maybe different parts from various action figures or different vehicles that you might be customizing or something like that. And that's basically all it is you're just bashing together parts and coming up with a new idea. There's a term called MOC, and you may immediately think mint on card, but it's actually another term that's used too, and it's called my own creation. So a lot of people will throw that term around, and it's just their own idea that they've usually created from the ground up. And then of course there's custom or customizing, which is the main thing, and you should already know what that is, but it's whenever you're customizing a figure, whenever you're coming up with your own thing, and you're usually taking something that's straight off the shelf and you're putting together your own idea. There's a term called purist. Some people may not have heard that, but there is people that feel that they're a purist, and whenever they're putting together an action figure, say a G.I. Joe figure, they're only going to use the parts that was used by Hasbro to make that particular figure, because they're not going to go outside of the source and use something from Mattel or something from another company. And so they are considered a purist. There's a term called scratch build. And scratch build is whenever you're just going from the ground up, like I had said a while ago, and you're making your own idea. You're just creating it from scratch, from parts that you have laying around, styrene pieces, or the next term that I'm going to talk about, a greebly, and you're just putting together your own thing. Greebly or greebles, or there's other ways of saying it. All that is just whenever you're putting little pieces together and creating stuff that looks like tech or some kind of detail. It doesn't really actually amount to anything, but it adds the look to whatever you're building. It's generally used in sci-fi type stuff and Star Wars and various things like that. There's a term called mod, and all you're doing there is you're modifying, which is just customizing. It's the same thing, but some people will use mod instead of custom. And going along with the mod, there's various forms of it, like set mod, which is a lot of times used in Legos, but some people will use that term loosely for some other stuff. And then there's part mod, and what you're doing there is you're actually modifying a specific part. You're just taking that one thing. Again, it's used a lot in Legos, but it's also used in model building and action figure stuff. So that's another idea of how people use that particular term, part mod. Custom sets is another idea, and again, it's a lot in the Lego world, but some people will put together custom sets of different kind of customizing action figures, and they'll actually build a set that they'll sell, and all you have to do is follow instructions to put it together. It's just another idea of how some people are getting some of their stuff out there. Custom parts, that's again, you're usually, a lot of times I would say you're going to use that in the 3D world, because you're printing together various custom parts that you're selling to other people to use, or you're using it yourself to create the custom thing that you're wanting to make. And that's just kind of like scratch build, I guess you would say. And then there's also casting, and that kind of gets off into a whole different thing, and I'm probably going to do a video directly of casting. But what you're doing is you make a part and you actually cast that particular part out of a silicone rubber mold, and then you're pouring resin into the mold to duplicate that part, and you can make it over and over and over. And that's generally what people do whenever they're selling their cast parts, and it's used a lot in action figures and doing model kits and all kinds of different things there too. So there's tons and tons of different ways people are casting. And going off of casting, there's also injection molding, and this is whenever you're actually melting plastic and injecting into a mold, and it's the closest to what you're going to see right off the store shelf. There's also the term repro. Repro is reproduction, and that's whenever you're taking probably let's just say a Star Wars figure, and something straight from the 70s. It's a 5-point articulation, which is the easiest to cast, and so you're just reproducing that figure, and you're making your mold, and you're putting your resin in, or you're doing your injection molding, and you're reproducing the figure, and that's where everybody calls it repro. And going off of repro, there is the other term copy. That's also the exact same thing, but some people prefer to call it a copy instead of a repro. And then a variant right off of that is bootleg. And some people will call copied figures or repro figures bootleg, which technically they are. I mean, you're just taking it and reproducing the figure that the big companies did, and then you're trying to make it yourself. So, but it goes really further than that, and it's different things that Chinese companies will actually mass produce, and it'll come out of China and go into places like Big Lots and stuff, and that's really the term of bootleg that most people think of. There's a term called chop that you may hear some people say, and what that actually is whenever you're cutting apart a figure, you're chopping it up, and so you'll hear somebody say, I chopped the figure, and that's usually about what they're talking about, is they're just cutting it up and repositioning parts, and like they'll cut a foot off of a figure to glue onto another figure or something like that. So that's another term. And when most people are talking about action figures and the base of the figure, and this is usually an industry term, they'll call it a buck. And the buck of the figure is actually the core, what they'll use to sculpt all the detail to. And it makes it easier for the different lines of action figures if they have a core figure to work with. Like if you look at the current classic He-Man figures, those bodies are the exact same bodies, and then they just put different pieces over the top of it to create new figures. Prototype is also another term, and this is whenever you create anything, a figure or vehicle or any of the different things, and your very first item is going to be the prototype. If you're mass producing it, you have to make one to be able to see exactly how everything's going to go and what you might need to do on all of the rest of the figures. And then in the terms of painting and stuff like that, you'll hear people talk about a wash or a paint wash. And what that is you've seen me on a previous video where I dilute the paint and actually paint it into the different details and let the watered down paint flow into all of the different parts, and then you wipe it off and you end up getting all of that detail that's going to be shown. And so that's where a lot of people call it a wash, because they're putting a liquid version of that paint down, and it's going in as a wash. And then the other term that goes along with it is dry brushing. And with dry brushing, you're barely getting any paint on the paintbrush, and you're real lightly touching your part, and you're getting just a little bit of residue of the paint that's sticking down, and it's considered a dry brush because you're bringing out the details. And then there's different types of joints on the action figures, and there's a lot of people that get confused with some of that, and it's a couple different types of joints that is used, and I'll explain that. The cut joint is whenever you see those different type of angle cuts on an action figure and they put a joint into it and it's got a swivel to it, but it's just a different way that some companies like to do their joints. A hinge joint is like what you usually see on the action figure elbows whenever you have those two pegs that's got a center peg that goes in, and you have the kind of like a swivel that it just goes back and forth, and that generally is where you get your term of that. That's generally where that comes from. And then there's a swivel joint, and usually they'll combine like the hinge joint on an elbow with a swivel joint, so you'll have like the swivel battle action that the old G.I. Joe figures had from the 80s, and some of the modern stuff where they'll have that combined joint. And it's just another way that they connect all the different ways for a figure to use. And then there's a ball joint, and ball joints is where they're combining more or less a swivel joint and a hinge joint together, and it's in a ball shape, so that way it can be able to insert into like the shoulder of an action figure or the hip of an action figure and be able to create that ball movement. And then there's also where they directly have a ball that goes into a socket that'll pop in, and you still create that same type of movement where you've got complete directional control to be able to pose your action figures. And then there's a joint called a dumbbell joint, and usually you've got like two balls on both ends with a peg in the center, and one ball will connect into the head of an action figure, and then the other part will go on the shoulder, so that way you get a little bit more range of motion when you're moving the head around. And you'll have, of course, like I said with the ball joint, you'll have the ability to position it by spinning the head around or lifting it up or go back and forth. So it's another idea that you see probably, I'd say, mostly in Marvel Legends and things like that. And then you may have heard the term flocking. Flocking is like Mossman or Panther from He-Man. And some of the different times companies will do that to create hair, the old G.I. Joe figures from the 70s. And it's just where they'll apply like a glue to a surface, and they have a machine where little particles comes up, and it's little hair type follicles, and you end up with a flocked type of feature. So that's about all the terms that I can really come up with right now. What type of terms do you know of that maybe I didn't say? You can add it in the comments, and we can talk about it. And there's stuff that I just haven't heard myself, and I've been in the customizing world for a long time, but sometimes you just don't hear some of these things. So that about does it for this episode. I hope you liked what I was talking about, and it gave you a little bit of an idea of some of these different ways that people talk in the custom world, and it'll give you the ability to engage in conversations on Facebook and stuff. So hopefully that worked for you. Please like, share, and subscribe, and ring the bell icon so that way you can be able to know for sure that I've uploaded. I'm trying to do a weekly video. We'll see you next week on Trying to Make It.